A little bit, went to Shake Shack. And
Shake Shack moment. And then came back to the apartment and napped.
Oh.
Yes, felt that though.
Yeah.
I was like, how much you love me.
It was
You're making that.
for life. What's happening on the ball today? It's very interesting.
Here.
oh, I saw.
Where is that?
Holy
data that he brought to us. So we're like going over there. So, okay.
I feel
He was doing report.
And only going on the stressor or the interactions and transcribe. And so like slides like the patterns of how the soul would or whether. Yeah.
Actually really.
And then another one.
I love.
Like. All right, hello. Welcome everybody. Happy Wednesday night to the first speaker series of the spring. Tonight we have Dr. Laura Chávez-Moreno and Dr. Mike Mena, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. And then for those of you who are sharing, especially by live stream, if you don't know about the Masters in Educational Transformation, we are a program that uses, that trains folks through residency-based model to engage in policy and advocacy or in classrooms. It's an interdisciplinary program with a commitment to anti-racism and social justice in education. And if you're joining us online, you're interested in knowing a little bit more, you can certainly check out our website, and our next application date is April 1st. So reminding all of you about that as well, if that's something that you're interested in. So good to see all of your faces on a Friday night, and I will introduce our speakers for us. So our first speaker is Dr. Laura Chávez-Moreno. She's an award-winning interdisciplinary scholar and assistant professor at UCLA's Cesar Chavez Department of Chicano and Central American Studies. Professor Chávez-Moreno studies how schooling teaches about race and racism and makes Latinidad. She connects these theorizations with questions about educational equity, particularly in the areas of language and literacy. Her research critiques systems of oppression in schooling and supports advancing education for self-determination. She's an expert in critical race theory in education, and she uses critical theories of race from diverse academic disciplines to examine educational policy and practices. Professor Chávez-Moreno is a 2022 National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation postdoctoral fellow, one of the most prestigious early career research awards for education researchers. Her research has been published in the American Educational Research Journal, Handbook of Latinos in Education, Journal of Teacher Education, and Educational Researcher, among others. And then Dr. Mike Mena is a Mexican-American researcher and assistant professor at Brooklyn College, CUNY. Mike focuses on the ideological perceptions of race and language in the context of American education and was awarded the NAED Spencer Dissertation Fellowship in 2021 to conduct his research. As an educational technologist and public intellectual, Mike's award-winning YouTube channel, The Social Life of Language, serves as a contemporary and activist pedagogical model to those interested in producing accessible and engaging educational content designed to engage wider publics, with special attention paid to reaching students of color, as well as promoting the work of marginalized scholars. For his service and media expertise, he was awarded the Carnegie Educational Technologist Fellowship in 2021. So with that, we'll welcome Dr. Chávez-Moreno. Get started.
Can you hear me through the microphone, or is it? Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you, Anne, for all the help making the trip happen. So it's an honor to be invited. I'm really excited about the discussion we're going to have afterwards. And I wanted to share that the ideas that I'm going to share right now are not ideas that I'm married to. So if you have doubts, if you have questions, if something doesn't make sense, please share. I'd love to hear your perspective about some of the ideas that I'm going to share today. Okay, thank you. So I've titled the talk is Latinx a racial group, and why does this matter to educators? And this talk is based on a chapter in this Handbook of Latinos and Education. Oh wait, are you? Okay, great. And it was published in 2001, and I shared it with Krista in case someone's interested in reading that. And And before I get started with describing what's in the chapter, I'd like to ask you, what is Latinx? Is it an ethnicity, or are we talking about something like more of a race? And I'm curious about some of your thoughts, so I'm hoping for you to share with someone near you or next to you. And then I'm going to ask for people to let me know what you think, okay? So give you a couple of minutes. Yeah.
How to like identify, and I don't need that. Really have that basic
I'm trying to pull this.
report, like when you do when you register yourself. I mean, where do I fall in that kind of thing? I don't know. That's why I have a hard time. Two questions. No, totally. So philosophical. Yeah. So one is like. It's really it's a big one. It's a big word. I learned too much about it. It is. I truly don't like it. Yeah. Also, and also about it, everything but yeah. Like it's really it brings like how do you like how do you ask that question and how do you that's like struggling with that term in itself like as exactly. I feel like it's just a way to like.
Are we good? Is it okay if we move on? Yeah.
That's great.
Good.
So, yeah, like should
Is it okay if we move on? Thank you. Thanks. I was able to listen to a little bit. Does anyone want to share some of the ideas that people share? Oh, I can tell you my answer, but go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I'll go. When talking about race, we saw it as a social construct of just like a way to identify people, to classify people. That's kind of what we talked about.
Okay, great. Anyone else want to share something that shared a little different, something different? Great. So thank you. Let me move on to give you a little bit of an overview of my talk. So I do state, and you don't have to agree with me, a lot of scholars perhaps won't agree with me either, but I do state that Latinxes are a racialized group, not an ethnicity. And I'm going to share what I mean by race and what I mean by ethnicity, because in order for us to answer that question, we need to know what those things are, right? So we're going to talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I view race and how I differentiate it from ethnicity and why I think it's important for us to think about them differently, especially for those who are going to be working in education, either as policy makers or as educators. So the first part of my talk, I'm going to be talking about this. What are the two different things? I'm going to give you some definitions. And like I said, we don't have to agree. You could write down your questions or doubts. The second part I'm going to share about how for Latinxes, the Spanish language and bilingualism are seen as signature features of Latinxes. The third part of the talk, I'm going to complicate conceptualizing Latinxes as bounded by the Spanish language or bilingualism. And I'll explain what I mean by bounded. And then the fourth part of the talk, I'm going to ask us to reconceptualize Latinx as a racialized group with boundaries constructed based on multiple colonialisms. So this is how I structured the talk into these four parts, all right? And before I I get into this, let's talk about why this matters. Why does this matter for people who are preparing to be in education? So it matters because schooling teaches us about race and racism, even if it doesn't teach us explicitly, like, for example, the way that we are taught in school, what is a metaphor, what is an algebraic equation, etc. But it really does teach us about our racialized world in explicit and implicit ways. It teaches us not just about race and racism, it teaches us about racialized categories and the delineations of these categories. And we need to know about our social context and our histories. This is why it's important for us to think about these kind of things when we're going into education. Schoolings contribute to our critical consciousness development about race, or they can contribute, right? And our critical consciousness plays a part in forming cross-racial coalitions, excuse me. And some of you who may be going into ed policy more than, for example, teaching, it also matters because if you see them as an ethnic group, perhaps the types of policies that you would be advocating for would be different than if you saw them as an ethnic group, right? So this is why these kind of things matter. It's not just a theoretical question for us, in my opinion. So let me talk about my positionality, how I engage in this work, where I come from. So I'm a Mexican immigrant from northern Mexico. I came to the US when I was 8 years old. And I prepared to be a teacher of Spanish. All my training from undergrad to graduate school have been in colleges of education. So although I am a professor right now in a Chicano and Chicano studies program, my training is really in education. So when I was an undergrad, I was preparing to be a Spanish teacher. And I was a Spanish teacher in Philadelphia for 5 years. I taught in 2 different high schools. And but I've taught all the way from kinder to graduate school, right? So everything in between. And I became a teacher because a Spanish teacher specifically because I saw Spanish very linked to what it meant to be Latinx. And I wanted to be able to help other Latinx students who wanted to maintain their Spanish. So that was my goal in terms of why I wanted to become a teacher. Okay, so now I'm going to move to my first argument, which is Latinxes are a racialized group just like Black folks or Asian American folks. And I assert that Latinxes are not an ethnicity. And I make this distinction between race and ethnicity because we need more words to explain our social reality, not less words. So I'm against synonymizing these terms, even if they do overlap, all right? And I'm going to share this part with some definitions, like I mentioned before. So I think of ethnicity as referring to shared cultural practices. That is a group who makes similar meaning based on, similar meaning of their routine practices. What are their daily routine practices that they engage in? This is how people can see themselves as part of an ethnicity. It has to be the routine practices that they engage in collectively, right? And that they make similar meaning of these routine practices. So ethnicity highlights the similarities and the differences of people's cultural practices. And although ethnic categories could also serve the purpose of determining the in-group and the out-group, the purpose of American Eurocentric conceptions of race is nefarious, which is I'll talk about it a little later. So the ideas of race, excuse me, there's like a little bug around me. That's why I'm like shooing it away. So these ideas of race mean to create the illusion that biological race exists, and they mean to essentialize people. So this is the nefariousness of race versus ethnicity. And I'll talk a little bit more about ethnicity in a second. So race is about putting people into a white supremacist racial hierarchy, which I'll talk about also. So let me elaborate a little bit on, before I elaborate more on ethnicity, I'm going to elaborate right now, define race. So race refers to a European originated classification system and ideology that assumes that in the history of humanity, there were groups of people who reproduced with each other in isolated regions of the world, and that this isolated mating created distinguishable, biologically distinct groups or human lineages. We know that this is wrong and that humans did not reproduce in isolation. We know that humans are basically genetically the same, that we are the same species. And European elites imagined these blood differences between humans to believe in order to oppress certain groups, okay? So I'm gonna, excuse me. So European elites imagined they socially constructed differences, these differences of different groups to differentiate and to delineate the groups. And creating those groups was necessary in order to then indicate which groups were human and which groups were worthy, right? And this classification system and ideology of race was meant to result in putting whites on top of this racial hierarchy, which is why I call it a white supremacist racial hierarchy, so that whites could materially benefit from having racialized others underneath them in this white supremacist racial hierarchy. But again, social and basic science tells us that race is a social construct. So we hear this again over and over again, especially in education. Race is a social construct, right? Race is not biological. And how this racial system delineates the categories is constantly shifting. So the boundaries of the categories change, and they don't make sense to race being biological. So when I'm talking about race, I'm talking about this idea, like I said, that there's these different racialized groups. And when I'm talking about the boundaries is what's the difference between this group versus the other one, right? Because when we're talking about race, we're always talking about like, you're this because you're not that. So this is what I'm talking about in the boundaries. But if you see here the map that I made, you see that the circles are kind of neat, you know, et cetera. But really, this doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't make sense at all because race is not real, right? But helpful to think about this way, because then you can kind of figure out like, okay, this is the difference between race and ethnicity. When we're thinking about ethnicity, we're talking about particular people's, how they compare themselves in terms of their cultural practices to people that for example, that they come in contact with or that they hear about, etc. Because they see the different cultural practices. And in the same little bitty zone, you can have lots of ethnicities. But when we're talking about the way that race was conceived that dominates here in the US, we're thinking about like these big racialized groups. Does this make sense, the difference between race and ethnicity? So I do want to share that race is not a personal, individual characteristic or choice. Rather, race is a category that is constructed from also being compared to others. Race is a category that is meant to oppress certain groups and to erase their humanity. And for me, this is a clear definition of the distinction between race and ethnicity. That ethnicity could be used in bad ways in order for like to oppress other folks, but ethnicity could be that way. But it could also just be like comparing, like, oh, you grew up with, I don't know, plantains. I grew up with these other types of bananas. I don't know, something like this, right? It could just be kind of like, it's very normal for humans to compare themselves to other humans, right? Doesn't mean that you're doing it because you think that they're inferior. Whereas race is done in order, you categorize people by race in order to put them in this racial hierarchy. You see the difference? Okay, so let me talk about this other term, racialization. And in fact, in my scholarship, I've moved away from using the word race, and now I'm talking about racialized groups. Some of the things that I've been learning from, for example, philosopher Adam Hodgman, is that race, even when we talk about it as a social construct, some of the ways that we talk about it reifies it, makes it real. So it's better to talk about racialized groups because then we're talking about something that's imposed on the group in terms of a label, instead of race is something that you have. Make sense? So this is why I'm talking about racialized groups, and I'm also talking about the process of racialization in my work. And when I use the term racialization, I do not mean racial identification or racism or racial discrimination that Latinxs suffer or other people suffer. I use racialization to mean the process of racial formation and hierarchical categorization into racialized groups. In other words, when I'm talking about racialization, I'm referring to the marking of racialized boundaries, and this marking of boundaries is always relational to other groups. Okay? Like I said, I don't view Latinxs as an ethnicity. I see it as a race. And you've probably, or how many of you have heard that Latinxs are an ethnicity? How many of you had heard that before? Yeah, so it is something that in terms of, in popular culture and even in academia, okay? But this view, in my opinion, this view is usually because people usually attribute race to phenotype or to race based on the body. But this logic, I think, is incorrect, okay? The logic that Latinx's bodies are too different from each other incorrectly applies that other racialized categories have less diversity in their body-based features. Does this make sense? Okay, so this is why I think that this logic is incorrect. We shouldn't see Latinxes as similar in terms of, as two different. Their bodies are two different. That's why they're not a race. Okay, but then that leaves us with the question: then what is race? Okay, this is what I'm trying to answer today for us. So, like I said, there's also body and phenotype diversity in other people. On other races and other racialized groups. Some also say that Latinxes are not a race because they can be, for example, white or they can be black. For example, there can be white Latinxes or Afro-Latinos, etc. But we also need to remember that there are people who identify as biracial in all these type of different racial categories also. So just because there could be other people who identify in terms of, like, for example, I have one of my parents is white, one of my other parents is Asian American. That doesn't mean that then therefore you don't have a race, right? Or you're one is a race and then the other one is not. Okay. So I also want to mention that in the US Census, a lot of people who are Latinxes, about 42% of them actually marked down in the census that they are another race because they don't really identify with the other races. I just wanted to mention that because that always comes up, okay? So to go back to my argument that Latinxes are a racial category, let's remember what the purpose of race is. What is race supposed to do? So the purpose of race is to designate certain people as less worthy and less human. Race is meant to be a category that dehumanizes racialized people by placing people among other people so that, and that they may feel that they might, even if they don't feel a shared sense of like cultural practices, right? So for example, I teach at UCLA, there's a lot of people who are from Mexican families or some of them who are from Central American families. And people who are, for example, Central American, sometimes they resent the fact that like everyone thinks everyone else is Mexican. So they're like, no, we're not Mexican. We have different practices. We eat this or we do this instead, etc. So they don't see themselves as a cultural group either, as an ethnicity. They don't have these shared cultural practices. And like I mentioned before, there's, let me move on, excuse me. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about in terms of the purpose of race. So race refers to this category that puts people into groups in order to hierarchicalize and oppress. And in putting people into these categories, race ignores the intragroup diversity of cultural practices within the group, and race overlooks how the people themselves would see themselves in terms of the culture with other folks. And notice that I have the lines here of the groups. And the lines, it's like a little square. The lines are a little different. So then what I'm saying is that race, depending on which racialized group, it could be constructed in a different way. So for example, for some groups, their skin color may be something that's more resonant in terms of like how that group is racially bound. For Latinxes, I'm arguing that that boundedness, that line is actually the Spanish language. People identify Latinxes as based on, do you know Spanish? Or are you supposed to know Spanish? So even if you don't know Spanish, if you're supposed to know Spanish, you would be Latinx. Does this make sense? So like I said before, a while ago, I said, body is not really something that is just 100% like what race is. It really matters in terms of, hi, welcome. It really matters in terms of like, which category are we talking about and how we identify them as a racialized group, all right? So here I'm talking that the signature feature that delineates the boundaries of Latinxes is that they're imagined to have the shared Spanish language and bilingualism, even if this is, like I said, just in imagining that they should know Spanish, okay? My statement doesn't mean that physical characteristics, that national origin, that immigration status, that those don't affect how people are racialized. That's not what I'm saying, okay? These also affect Latinxes, and they also, of course, affect other racialized groups. Generally and problematically, skin tone and other indicia of phenotype, for example, eye shape and language, all matter to how Latinxes and others are racially identified. But the different racialized groups have different delineations, which is what I showed in this with these little lines. For example, Asian Americans get racially categorized based on whether they're from certain nation states in Asia. And what I'm suggesting is that the Spanish language and bilingualism is a signature feature that delineates Latinxes. In other words, I argue that Latinxes, Spanish and language bilingualism are used to create these racial boundaries around Latinidad. Now, in the chapter, I focus a lot about a book by Dr. Cristina Mora, who's at UC Berkeley. Her book is called Making Hispanics: How Activists, Bureaucrats, and Media Constructed a New American. And this book is an excellent book. In her book, Dr. Mora argues that government bureaucrats, the media, and activists all contributed to creating the Hispanic category. She discusses how from the creation of the Hispanic category in the US, the group was often referred to as Spanish-speaking people. And people fought to make the category more inclusive of Latinxes who didn't know Spanish. And the multiple interests, for example, the media and the bureaucrats, they negotiated into what it meant to be this Hispanic label. So for example, activists wanted to make the Hispanic label define more about the colonialism and the suffering of the people, but that was considered too militant for people who were government bureaucrats or the media. Excuse me. So as these different groups negotiated and worked to create this category, the category became more politically palatable and also became more vague and more ambiguous. So for example, Hispanic group was linked to its shared values around the role of family. Hispanics were linked by their shared culture, supposedly. But again, this idea that Latinxes have a shared culture and values, again, this is incorrect, right? And the idea that Latinxes have this shared culture and value was actually manufactured by these specific, by these interests, the government bureaucrats and by the media. So when we hear about like, oh, Latinxes are so family oriented, et cetera, it comes from this era that Cristina Mora documents of the creation of this category, okay? So Dr. Mora shows that the category's definition was based on the shared cultural and Spanish language. It made the term more politically palatable. But I also argue that it also became more vague. And this vagueness made it possible for it to then be seen as this default of the Spanish language. So even though people always said like, but not all of them speak Spanish, right? People always said this. It's true, but because it was such a vague category, it was always just defaulted into Spanish. And for example, in her book, this type of in the blue text, this kept being mentioned. So language was a unifying characteristic for the Spanish origin population. This part in text, this text in blue kept coming up and up in her book. Now, this is not an argument that she makes in terms of the vagueness leading into this default characterization of Spanish language. This is an argument that I'm making from the reading of the history that she presents. Now, with this idea, now, even as I suggest that the signature feature that delineates the racial category is the shared ties to Spanish, and that this creates the boundaries of the Latinidad category, I say that this is not a useful way to this is not a useful way for us to socially construct the category, and that we need to problematize delineating Latinxes based on Spanish language and bilingualism, because this erases the history of Spanish colonialism and prevents the group from establishing critical consciousness that helps to more easily form coalitions with racialized groups, with racialized others. And with the idea that we delineate Latinxes based on the Spanish language and bilingualism, I'm not going to move to part 3 of the argument. In this part, I argue for reconceptualizing how we delineate, how we socially construct Latinxes, and I argue for delineating the Latinx group based not on the Spanish language. So I'll present the main reason why we need to do so. First, I'm going to mention that all racializations are problematic, and all of them are fraught with tensions and contradictions in their particular ways. The main problem that I see in constructing the boundary of the Latinx racialized group through the Spanish language and bilingualism is that constructing it through the Spanish, even if it's an imagined Spanish, delineates the group based on the violent colonialism from Spain, which imposed the Spanish language on this group of people. And it was violent acts that imposed the Spanish language on Latinxes, and delineating the Latinx racialized group based on the Spanish language is a symptom of a society that erases colonial histories and defines the racialized others based on them being forced to adopt the language of the colonizer. So I see big problems with this, right? I hope you do too. So I argue that delineating the Latinx category based on language continues Spain's colonization project that violently imposed the language. In other words, by continuing to socially construct this group based on the Spanish language, we participate in the social construction of a Latinx category that overlooks colonial histories. We help erase the history of Spanish colonialization of what many now know as Latin America. So dehistoricizing or erasing histories contributes to further dehumanizing people who suffered from Spanish colonialism. What should we do to counter this? I argue that we should remember the activists that Dr. Mora describes as wanting to define Latinxes as bounded by their shared histories and suffering from colonialism and oppression. And I propose that this is what we should do to advance this delineation of a Latinx racialized group based on different types of boundaries. Excuse me. So along with remembering the definition proposed by the activists that Dr. Mora describes, I'm also guided by Dr. Laura Gomez's book, Manifest Destinies, The Making of the Mexican American Race. And I think I heard someone mention that a little earlier. So in that book, Dr. Gomez advances the idea that Mexican Americans suffered through a historical process of double colonization. She describes double colonization as Mexican American people having to negotiate two racial projects, the first by Spain's colonizers and the second one by the US. So inspired by Dr. Gomez, I propose the idea that what delineates the Latinx racialized group is their shared histories with multiple colonialisms. By multiple colonialisms, I'm referring to the colonization from Spain, the American colonization here in the nation state, which includes settler colonialism, and it also refers to America's imperialist project abroad. So let me explain what I mean by US imperialism as different from settler colonialism. I use American imperialism to refer to the structure, consequences, and actions of US foreign intervention in nation states outside of what is commonly perceived as the American nation state. I propose that the multiple colonialisms demarcation for the Latinx racialized group because it highlights that Latinxes have had their homelands devastated by American imperialism, settler colonialism, and that Latinxes still contend with anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. Some of you may be thinking that it's really hard to change how people define a racialized category, and I definitely agree, okay? But if we believe that race is a social construction, as we've been hearing over and over again, right? Then we are part of the society and we're part of being able to make a difference in terms of how people think about the social construction, right? And if you're going to be an educator, even more so, because you're going to have the opportunity to teach about race if you'd like to, right? And even if you don't want to, you're still teaching about race, in my opinion, but we can talk about that another time too, okay? So we can change the social construction, and schools influence how society thinks and teaches about race and the boundaries of the different racialized groups. So with this idea, I'm going to shift to the implications for educators and to address the question, what can educators do to help us move towards a change in how Latinxes are socially constructed to how the Latinx racialized group is delineated? So first, think about how you talk about and you teach about race. It matters how you talk about race. So for example, do you talk about it as if it's biological? Do you talk about the purpose of race? Do you talk about race as something that's meant to erase human distinctions? Do you talk about racial hierarchies as if they're meant to oppress certain people and give others material advantages? In the end, race is about giving people material advantages over others. And it matters how we talk about Latinxes. So for example, think about how do you talk about Latinxes as having a shared culture or having shared values? Do you talk about the people in terms of their origins in Spanish-speaking Latin America? You conceptualize the group as having a shared history with oppression. So all of these things matter in terms of how we're talking about Latinxes. Because if we're just always just saying like, oh, well, they have the same holidays or they all speak Spanish, etc., we're also erasing this part of the racialization process. So educators and scholars, educators and scholars contribute to how society understands certain concepts, and consequently, they should consider what ideas they advance in their work. It can help to reconstruct the Latinx label by moving away from the problematic understanding of Latinx based on language and bilingualism. They can help by adopting a view of the Latinx racialized group as delineated by multiple colonialisms and by learning about these histories. In my chapter, I offer a definition of Latinx, and I'm going to conclude by offering this definition to us. It's in the blue text here. So Latinx refers to a racialized group of people who reside in the US, are imagined to have a connection to the Spanish language bilingualism, and who have shared histories of suffering from multiple colonialisms, specifically Spanish colonialism, American colonialism, and American imperialism. And I hope that this small offering can help us to reconceptualize what is Latinx and help us think about this group as suffering multiple colonialisms. Thank you for listening, and I'm very excited about your thoughts and doubts and questions. Thank you.
Go ahead and transition to Dr. Mena, and then we'll have a shared Q&A after both talks.
Thank you. Before cheers. Want the mic?
Sure. First. Test. Working? Should have turned it after I put. Okay, so while we're getting something ready over here, I'm Dr. Mike Mena, and I wanted to remind you guys that there is a difference between critique. Criticism, you're just bashing something, and fun sometimes, right? Critique offers a different offering a bit of a bashing, but then it kind of says like, hey, maybe we can do this. Or maybe it'll point out the problems that maybe other people don't see. That's we can do something. This talk is the spirit of critique, not criticism, a critique.
Thank you for bearing with us as we technical difficulties.
Oh, just kidding. I have a USB. I have another. And if not, the show must go on. No. Okay, so we're going on without that part, but it's okay because I actually don't use PowerPoint. I was going to show you guys a video in the background. But a PowerPoint, so I just have stuff going on in the background. So welcome, friends, and in the spirit of Malcolm X, I'm Dr. Mike Mena from Brooklyn College, and today's talk is titled Soft Linguistic Terrorism for the 21st Century, the Language Elsewhere. Language elsewhere, that's the main keyword, right? So this talk has two parts. Part one is on this thing called the language elsewhere. And then part two, we're going to take a step back and talk about this presentation that I'm giving you today. So it's kind of going to be on how I present research as a so-called public intellectual, academic influencer, academic YouTuber, and these are all names people have given me over time. So it's kind of gonna be a meta presentation on the presentation itself. Done before, but see what happens. Should be. So for a few years now, I've been conducting research at a self-reported English-Spanish bilingual university in Deep South, University of Texas Rio Grande Valley, UTR. This opened in 2015. Campus is located only a couple miles away from the border wall that Donald Trump loved to speak in. Although on Fox News, you would think that the Rio Grande Valley, this region, is this lifeless desert with dirt roads and army of illegal Mexicans crossing the border nonstop, right? In the video that I was going to show you all, I was going to show you all things like having grass and paved streets and electricity. It's not a desert the way Donald Trump loves. In Fox News, in the border, just, this is the imagined view of what the border looks like, supposedly. But this is where the university also is located, right on the Texas-Mexico border. In fact, from one of the campuses, you can actually cross the river into Mexico. That's how close to Mexico we are when we're talking. So this is the geographic location of UTR. Now, after talking with dozens of faculty and students, I noticed this idea of a standard Spanish. So eventually, I just started asking people, where does standard Spanish come from? Who speaks standard Spanish? And the answers sounded a whole bunch of different ways, but they would always sound something like Spain has pure Spanish, or Puerto Rico speaks the good Spanish, or my friend from Monterrey, Mexico speaks proper Spanish. In all these conversations, people pointed elsewhere, identifying every Spanish-speaking country in the world except the United States. The best Spanish comes from far away. Further away, better. Always from elsewhere. A language from elsewhere. There was one answer that I never heard, not once across the dozens of interviews. Not one person ever said, my mom speaks the best Spanish, or my dad, or my grandma, my grandpa. Pure Spanish was never from home, never from the region, never from Texas, but always from elsewhere. That became something I wanted to think about. Why always this elsewhere? But today I'm talking about this standardized linguistic object, or what I call the language elsewhere. Or maybe for today we can call it the Spanish from elsewhere. And we're talking about how it emerges in everyday life, and also how it emerges in a university located in South Texas, right? But I have trouble describing the language elsewhere as a definable, real linguistic object, or something equivalent to this linguistic object we call standard language. Because as we will see, language elsewhere shapes, becomes what it needs to be to reproduce social, racial, and linguistic names, changes features, it changes structure, it even changes. And because it becomes what it needs to be, I much prefer calling it a linguistic imaginary as opposed to a linguistic object, because the word imaginary focuses our attention on how we imagine standard language. Because technically, standard language should only exist one way, right? The standard way. That's why it's called standard language. It doesn't, and we'll see that. So We're focusing on this thing called a so-called standard Spanish, but we will reimagine it as a Spanish from elsewhere. For example, some university participants called it Spain Spanish, or Mexico Spanish, international Spanish, or global. Other times, participants located this Spanish from elsewhere right outside the home, spatially localized to educational institutions, but just not from the home, but from elsewhere. Some of these names were high register Spanish, proper Spanish, academic Spanish, high level Spanish, and even our good old friend, standard Spanish. Within these names is an implied linguistic hierarchy, or a blunt dichotomy between standard language and substandard language, between speakers and substandard. Language becomes what it needs to be, activate and enable the production of this standard versus substandard dichotomy. However, the idea is not to treat language elsewhere, what I'm talking about today, as this definable real object. For example, something that is like standard Spanish, but instead, in following theorist Angela Reyes, the idea is to conceptualize these linguistic objects as, quote, as things made to seem real by wider and longer structural processes that regard them as such. Claiming standard language exists over and over and over and over again, so eventually it comes brought into being just by its very mention over and over and over again in educational institutions. So I want to illustrate how the language elsewhere emerges in everyday talk from three different positionalities, from two students, one faculty member, and one administrator, all from this same university. As we will see, each person conceptualizes standard language differently, meaning there was no standardized way people talk about what standard language is. It simply becomes what it needs to be from moment to moment, literally from sentence. Yet every Spanish from elsewhere was similar, or at least vaguely unified, in the way that it was always regarded as something other than what is spoken in the homes. Typically, good Spanish comes from elsewhere, never the home, never the family, never South Texas, never the United States. So let's talk about a couple of these examples. Specifically, when standard Spanish is located geographically, because the geographic elsewhere is kind of easy. For this first quote, one current faculty member who grew up in this area in South Texas, they said, quote, call it Mexico City Spanish, but it's like the correct Spanish. I don't know what they call it. Castellano? I don't know. Maybe. I think that's what it's called. I don't really remember. In this conversation, a correct Spanish is located in a specific city in Mexico, right? Which the faculty member identifies as the language named Castellano. There's a language found in Spain and other Latin American countries. It's found in Mexico, but that's not what Mexico is. What's important in a statement like this is the widespread belief held by many of the lifelong residents of the region, their lifelong belief that a correct Spanish comes from elsewhere, such as affluent cities in Mexico, but also from this idealized monolingual Spain, or what scholar Rosina Lozano refers to as the invocation, Spanish fantasy path. This particular faculty member reads, writes, speaks, grades papers, and conducts his coursework in English. Yet he regularly characterizes his own Spanish language competence as not good enough. And he would always claim that he didn't understand his recent spoke what he described as perfect and correct Spanish, specifically the Mexico City. That's what he claimed he didn't speak. didn't speak as well as people who speak Mexico City Spanish. So therefore, he could not understand. This language elsewhere becomes what it needs to be to reproduce a standard and a substandard dichotomy, which helps bring forth the existence of so-called substandard speakers, but also substandard listeners. So this faculty member positions himself as a substandard listener with substandard comprehension skills and even a self-alleged linguistic incompetence. But does he really believe that he's a substandard? I would say probably not. He loves his Mexican immigrant students, and he loves his Mexican church. Well, I kind of see it more as a move to elevate the perception of Mexican immigrants. Kind of like saying, don't assume these kids don't know anything just because they're Mexican immigrants. The perfect Spanish from Mexico. That's how smart. That's the spirit that he's bringing out what he's saying, right? So that is a example of a geographic language. But now let's get into more abstract versions of a language. Because the language elsewhere concept doesn't actually require geography. That's just one thing that it's mediated through at times. Consistent theme though, locating academic Spanish as acquired or learned anywhere else but the homes of South Texas. So instead of thinking of an international elsewhere, we're thinking at a much smaller scale. So in elsewhere just outside the Mexican home. For example, one student named Miranda described her Spanish-speaking home as the following, quote, "The parents would always be like, I don't understand you. If I can't understand you speak Spanish." So I feel like that kept us with the oral language, and also the reading language, but it's more social. Like our language is a little bit more social, but now that I'm in school, that's when it's a bit more academic. So this student shifted the scale of the language elsewhere. Instead of invoking far off geographic locations and places, she created a spatial dichotomy between and academic language, between social language and school language. And how these idea of standard language continues to shape, it changes its form. Origins. Another student named Ramona described Spanish with her parents as explicitly, quote, not academic, but instead at home they speak, quote, the language of the Mexican. The language of the Mexican. So Ramona was half joking when she said this. She's a funny person. Yet that phrase, language of the Mexican, that phrase positions the home language as an aspect of the racialized body of the Mexican, while indirectly positioning academic Spanish as not having a body. We're seeing the language elsewhere change form again. It doesn't have a body anymore. And if it doesn't have a body, then it doesn't have a home. It doesn't have culture with political interests. It doesn't have an ethnicity. Most importantly, it doesn't. The language elsewhere becomes what it is. Finally, let's look at a university administrator. What she said. Now, the idea of adding academic language to students' linguistic is a very common pedagogical stance now. In the education world, we call it additive pedagogy because we're thought to be adding linguistic knowledge as opposed to older assimilationist pedagogies, which were invested in subtracting linguistic and cultural knowledges and replacing it with something called Americanness. So here I suggest, though, that the idea of adding linguistic resources traffics the soft implication, but is brought into the classroom from home is not good enough to be competitive on the job market. As this administrator said, quote, that you come in with your own language, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. We just need to work. I'm trying to add to it. I'm trying to expand it. I'm not trying to correct it. I'm not trying to erase it. But at the end of the day, you want students to know they can graduate and that they can find a job and they'll be more marketable than the monolingual. So at this university, end quote. So at this university, the home language is generally characterized as culturally enriching and something that must be honored. All of those colorful phrases that they. But I have never heard the home language talked about as if it was already economically valuable or already a form of knowledge that makes one competitive in the job market. It must be backed by a university degree that proves linguistic competence. Those are 4 different participants from 3 different positionalities, 2 students, 1 faculty, all conceptualizing the same linguistic imaginary quite differently. The language elsewhere shape-shifted on command. It changed names and form. It changed geographic and spatial origin, but it always smuggles in that dichotomy between standard and substandard, between correct and incorrect, between being racially embodied, bodiless, and finally between being an economically valuable language versus a linguistic practice that is simply not enough to be considered economically or socially. Language elsewhere becomes what it means, which then becomes the basis for another concept that we're all familiar with, what translanguaging theorist Ofelia Garcia calls the ultimate linguistic creation. And when I'm feeling a little, I'll call it the ultimate linguistic conspiracy. I am, of course, referring to the presumed existence of a so-called standard Spanish, standard language, spoken by a standard speaker, perfectly understood by the standard listener. Each of these concepts, we've never proven or exists, right? One of these concepts are often backed by a near theological commitment to their existence. Indeed, standard language has become an object of faith. And in case you guys think I'm being hyperbolic when I say theological commitment to standard, I can't tell you how many times students have claimed, these are students from the bilingual education department, how many times they have claimed to me that society would break down from small scale breakdowns between neighborhoods to race wars to dystopic scenarios where economic markets crash because communication breaks down to the development of new technologies completely stopping. They cease because they can't share findings in scientific language with each other, to even nuclear war from accidental miscommunication because we don't have a standard language, supposedly. The standard language as an object of faith seems to be the precarious glue holding humanity together. Funny when you realize, though, that it doesn't exist, yet it's still there holding humanity together. And while I call standard language a conspiracy in a kind of half-joking manner, when we think about what makes a really good, effective conspiracy, standard language has all the things. It has the support of academic and political institutions. It is at the center of many academic disciplines, especially language-related disciplines. But it's also assumed to be real by many, if not most, people in the United States. And like any good conspiracy, it is virtually impervious to evidence that contradicts it. In closing, how does this relate to Gloria Anzaldua's theory of linguistic terrorism? After all, the title of the paper has the phrase soft linguistic terrorism. So, Gloria Anzaldúa was a Chicana feminist theorist, and she attended this campus named where she and thousands of students were subjected called the speech. where Mexican students were lined up on registration day and then forced to speak out loud for the speech test. They were Mexican, majority of them white administrators. After the speech test, they were funneled into remedial classes meant to fix their called broken English. Their language, of course, was not good enough for them, as usual. Another way to say this is the local Mexican population supposedly could not speak standard English. The experience of growing up on the Texas-Mexico border and attending Pan American College would be central to Anzaldua's theory of linguistic terrorism, which foregrounded her experience as substandard or substandardized language user. So that standard-substandard dichotomy that was part of Anzaldua's theory of linguistic terrorism. And also, let's keep in mind that Anzaldua's writings are 30 to 35 years. So if I'm invoking Anzaldua's concept that she developed at Pan American College, how does it apply to this new university that promotes what I'm calling the language elsewhere? But today we've been talking about the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley, or UTRGV, which opened in 2015, currently the second largest Hispanic serving. UTRGV loudly markets itself as a B3 institute, bilingual, bicultural, biliterate, so 3 Bs. However, and here comes this one. Before it was named the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley, it was named Pan American College, the exact same university like Gloria Anzaldúa. Meaning that exact same standard-substandard dichotomy that Anzaldúa wrote about more than 35 years ago continues to thrive in the exact same region of Texas at the exact same university, the same campus. Obviously, conditions have changed, but the dichotomy continues to shape reality and work through a so-called standard Spanish. But in more recent educational context, linguistic terrorism works less so through punishment. I'll give you an example of punishment. Gloria Anzaldúa recalls being physically abused by teachers for speaking Spanish. My own mother, who grew up in Anzaldúa's time and is also from South Texas, shares that experience. So my mom recalls attending a local Catholic school where the white nuns would strike students with rulers for speaking Spanish. Mom was one. Those are explicit forms of, or physical forms of linguistic terrorism. But today things are different, which meant I needed to rethink using a word like terrorism, right? Because it's very, would call it hyperbolic. So I don't think it is. I think it's political. But we see today are updated forms of linguistic terrorism in much softer and slower articulations, re-articulations. This soft linguistic terrorism works much more through reward, specifically the promise of economic reward, the promise of social mobility, as well as the freedom from racial oppression. If one can just pass as the auditory equivalent of a monolingual, white, middle-class native. In this sense, soft linguistic terrorism works through reward, through innuendo, through ideological recruitment, by saying, your Spanish and your Latinx heritage are beautiful, but let's improve them. Because they're not good enough the way they are. In fact, soft linguistic terrorism can look like love, marrying, generations to manage. For example, my mom didn't teach me Spanish, but of fear that white teachers would physically hit me. This is a much softer, slower, intergenerational form of linguistic terrorism, where I experience the effects of that white nun some 30 years later. White nun that hit my mom is having effects on me. So my mom's experience of linguistic terrorism was made manifest a whole generation later for me in a much softer form, in a form that looked like protection. So linguistic standardization has long been recognized as a weapon used to dominate, colonial, and racialized. What's tricky about standardization is there's nothing standardized about it. Similarly, we must be aware that linguistic domination changes. The new forms emerge in new forms of terror. But if we take seriously that ideologies about language are always ideologies about people, that beliefs about language are always beliefs about people, and an attack on a person's language is an attack on a person. Following from here, we must consider how linguistic standardization is much more than an effort to standardize language, an effort to standardize life. But then which life? And then whose? Age-old question. That concludes the first part of today's talk on the language. I'd like to ask you all to write down your questions because we're going to take a curve way over here and kind of get off the top. Linguistic terrorism, the language. That was, and now we're going to move on to the meta presentation where I present on how I presented. Let's see if this works. Today's talk was meant to model what I do. And for me, it starts with remembering who I am, where I come from, what is the goal of my work. For example, if I was interested in positioning myself within the authority and legitimacy of linguistic anthropology, there would have been a dramatic shift in my vocabulary. For example, as a linguistic anthropologist, I would have given this exact same talk, totally different words. I would have been tempted to use words from, let's say, theorists Irving and Gall, maybe their notion of fractal recursivity, or the process by which dichotomies are disseminated across chronotopic scales via processes like semiotic erasure and iconicity, all of those words. What I have said today, earlier presentation, the first part, was this without using any. I probably would have been tempted if I indeed were through an academic position trying to invoke the power of academia at large, right? I probably would be tempted to use a PowerPoint. I'd probably want to put up all my quotes word for word and then write all the graphic discourse analysis symbols all over it. Perhaps I should be wearing a sports coat and a tie. They're all signs of academic authority that can be drawn upon, that can be invoked to make me look like a legitimate scholar. Now here's the thing. I always ask myself this for your teachers. I always ask myself, do my students actually care about me invoking signs of authority and academic stuff? I'm gonna guess 99% of the time, they don't care at all. I think it's actually us academics that are pretty judgy when it comes to looking at our colleagues. So to be clear, all the signs of authority, the academic language, the dress, the PowerPoint, all of it is the attempted standardization of academia itself, writing to the talking, dressing to the behaviors. Standardized practices must exclude people. That is almost the essence of what standards mean, right? They fix the features that should be regarded as norms. However, Even things like academic writing is not even a little bit standard. For example, every single academic journal uses their own style guide, uses their own specialist language. Right? That's not standard. Or think of an academic CV or a resume. Everyone's looks different. And at the same time, everyone thinks they know what real resumes look like or real CVs look like. This is what they should be. So to me, my personal philosophy is if non-specialists do not understand, wrong as a teacher. You can't call yourself a teacher if no learning is actually happening. That's just someone talking to themselves in very exotic jargon. That's just not a good look. So in my head, I am a former high school, and I take the high school teacher spirits, and I think of teaching former high school students. I think about teaching my mom. Mom does watch my YouTubes, by the way. She's a registered nurse, right? So she's not a semiotician. She doesn't know about linguistic anthropology. But just last year, just to freak me out, my mom sent out her annual Christmas letter, phrase from one of my YouTube videos, where she said something about the quote, semiotic affordances of the Christmas holiday. Affordances? Oh, my mom used it correctly too. Like that's actually that's the way you would use that phrase, right? Now, just the word affordance took me a while to understand. Then saying semiotic affordance, where you acknowledge the infinite relations of meaning and possibility, that's something that took me like 4 years to understand and read about. And here my mom is dropping it in her Christmas letter that she learned off of a 20-minute YouTube. But seeing that phrase written by my mom, made me really start believing something I didn't quite believe. Curious about it, I was suspicious about it. I believe it. That is the proposition that absolutely any concept, no matter how complex, no matter how fact and theoretical, it can be explained on specialism and what discipline you are in without specialist jargon of the discipline. So today I presented my entire paper in what I would call high school language. With really only one new word, the language elsewhere, maybe two, the phrase linguistic terrorism. I also presented my research in a narrative form, story from real life. When research is presented as a story, it tempts people to relate to the characters in that story. We're lucky, it draws the audience closer to our research. It's a good thing. But just because the language itself doesn't mean that the content itself was simplified. You just need to be more creative with things like metaphors and analogies and real world examples. My doctoral courses were what inspired me to get really creative with this pedagogical approach that I call transposition of academia. That's the word, transposition. This is what I use for my YouTube videos, but also for all of my public talks today with you guys. Transposition is a word I use to avoid the idea of translation. Because normally when people say that they're going to translate academic content for a general audience, they automatically think that something will be lost in the if you're stepping into the situation already thinking, I'm going to have to simplify everything. What is going to be lost in my presentation because I have to. If you go in with that attitude, you're already setting yourself up to not actually connect with your audience anymore. So let's think of so instead of thinking of my presentations as translation, as me translating academic texts for you, right? I think of it as something akin to or analogous to musical transposition. That's where I got the word from, transposition. Let me tell you what that is. So let's think of a very simple example of music. So if you think of a piano, right? Arranged from left to right, all the notes, low to high. They're all, each key is a measured interval that repeats over and over and over again. Play the song over here on the piano, but then you say, oh, I want to play it over here on this. That is transposition. So that is the exact same everything, the song, the piece, or whatever, transposed to a different key. Now, let's say you want to transpose the form itself. So let's say, taking a so the transposition involved changing the form itself, which happens a lot, especially. So for example, maybe a song might be written for a rock band, but then a high school marching band will transpose that song into a marching band song, marching band piece. So shifting the notes and the form, all of that is part of transposition. The same song, but it just might start on a different note, or it might be played on different instruments. So when it comes to teaching through transposition, let's think of a choir teacher. Choir teacher with a really low voice. The teacher has been trained for years and years on how to use their low voice, their low vocal register. Now, the first day of their middle school choir class, the teacher shows up and realizes that every student, every prepubescent student, sings way higher than they do, whether they're a man or a woman. When you're teaching super young kids, they usually have voices much higher than the instructor. The choir teacher has two choices here. They can try teaching in their own low vocal register, or they can try meeting the students where their physical capabilities are and attempting to teach at that much higher vocal register. Now let's first acknowledge how absurd it would be to try to teach students to sing lower than they're physically capable of singing. That would not be very successful. So instead, what the choir teacher must do, what the specialist must do, is think of all their training and transpose all of that training into the student's vocal range, into the student's capability. The teacher must go to the students, not the other way around. So as a principal, you must teach home turf. You are the expert, you are the teacher. Your responsibility to go to them. Your responsibility to translate knowledge for students and without being condescending. So for example, think of yourself as a linguistic anthropologist, having to teach your social science concept to a bunch of biologists, scientist people, right? They will likely have a totally different specialized language from you. But everyone in that room has PhDs, so we can assume everyone's. So the idea would be to transpose the nuance and complexity of your social science to the group of biologists who don't have any familiar with your social science. Now, here's the thing. When it comes to teaching, I always transpose. I would have given this exact same presentation. I would have given that presentation to a group of biologists if they, for whatever reason, wanted to learn about linguistic discrimination. The presentation itself is designed to be accessible to more people than just my linguistic anthropology. And since this presentation was written in high school level language, and because everyone there will likely speak high school level language, this brings up something weird but unsurprising. I've never gotten the complaint that said, I really wish that more complicated. I've also never gotten the complaint. Really wish. Forgot that either. In fact, I would go so far as to say that using high school language and not using PowerPoint appreciated by undergrad students and masters. That is a strange kind of proof that non-specialist language offer complexity and I would go even further than that. I've gotten messages with PhDs from full-blown senior faculty who have told me, hey, Mike, I watched your YouTube channel or one of your YouTube videos or whatever. It really helped me understand something I've been working on for a while. And I'm thinking like, oh my God. Oh, that I'm teaching. But they don't know that, so they don't perceive it because I don't condescending way of like, oh, let's make things simpler. But in using so at the center of my transposition approach, there's three pretty basic that you follow religiously should help you create accessible lessons for your students. Number one, don't use more than one or two special. Preferably one though. Oh, Lord, don't specialist language while attempting to define specialist language. Focus the energy on creativity. Nothing will be lost in translation if you creatively transpose metaphors, poetic language, graphs, video, all kinds of media that we use now. Now, notice how I invented the concept of transposition. Invented that concept through the analogy of musical transposition, with references to musical instruments, to children singing, to a choir teacher. I could have easily framed all of that discussion in specialist pedagogical language, using pedagogical concepts, things like scaffolding or culturally sustained pedagogy, et cetera, et cetera. Those are more keywords that I would need to define if I wanted my presentation to be a first principle of transposition. One keyword per lesson. Maybe two, preferably one though. Now the third principle, did I say the second principle? First principle was one specialist keyword. Second principle was focus energy on creativity. The third principle, if you can even call it that, because it kind of just overlaps with the other two, never assume prior knowledge. So this seems obvious, but it's so easy to forget. Now imagine if I said, transposition is like scaffolding. Here I'm using the language, I'm using specialist pedagogical language to define specialist language. So I just lost everybody in here that doesn't know what scaffolding is. That's why we have to prevent ourselves from getting so complex, but yet we can't. I've always said that I like to create content that is never simple. That is where that whole spirit comes. And it does come from being students. I don't know if anybody has the experience. It's kind of scary because they get bored really fast. They'll get lost. You when they're lost. So if anything, whenever I walk into a teaching situation, it's not always different to people because it's persons. Nothing different between how I would exactly. Which questions the whole idea of home language, or even the idea that academia has its own standard academic language. It's up to us as teachers to go to our students. We're not trying to bring them to us. We're not trying to drag them along. We're not trying to force them to sing in our low register when they can't because they're only like 5 or 6 years old. To go to them. Teach on. How I approach being a public. How I approach presenting. Great speaking to all. Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks to both of our speakers. If you would like, I can pull 2 chairs down here to the front, or you can stand, but we have about 15 minutes for a shared Q&A for folks to ask questions to our speakers. To stand, that's cool too, but I can also just come after you.
Friday. After work.
It's a real nerdy. Mhm. Something I would do. What are you doing on Friday? Yes.
Part of what you, oh, I'm sorry, Quincy Allegri Gambrell. I'm from the McCourt School of Public Policy, so new teaching. And a lot of what you were talking about, for some reason, did the standardization part of your presentation reminded me of code switching for some reason. This idea of that. I was wondering, and actually yours as well, for the linguistic part of it as well. So I'm wondering how that concept, I guess, fits into, well, I violated what you were trying to talk about before by using the word code switching, but nonetheless, I guess, like, how does that fit into reviews, I guess? Yeah.
No, go ahead.
It's like a very complex question. It's like, do you want to talk about it? Yeah, so it's an interesting because it assumes or presumes the switching back and forth between this one and that one. Now, when it comes to Latinos in the United States, the very presence of code works as proof or evidence that Latinos can't speak. Because even when it's not mixed, there's just this idea that, like, oh, well, they grew up in Spanish speaking. No Spanish, or maybe a few Spanish words or whatever. And because of that, their English is not pure. Spanish is not. So yeah, so something like code switching, or maybe in education where, well, if classes are divided between English, are expected to walk into the Spanish class and then standard go into the English or all the other classes, and they're expected to know the school language, the academic English. So to me, the concept of code switching is very much related to standardization in the sense that it is used as a of linguistic and racial governance. Like, it's just saying, like, hey, your language can never be good enough because it's already mixed. And how do we know it's mixed? Well, because you switch. Oh, you don't code switch? Well, you probably want to code switch, even if you don't.
Laura, I was wondering, so in the event that you are asking for information on, say, like a survey for like research purposes, how do you recommend that the question of race and ethnicity is asked, and what kind of options are provided if it's not a free response?
This is hard. I would, but if I could, I would suggest, for example, in the US Census, adding Latinx as a group, a racial group, not as an, how it is now, like something separate, something separate. Like I mentioned, 42% of people who would identify as Latinx mark down some other race. They don't see themselves as the other categories. So definitely I would add that right now to the, for example, if we're talking about the US Census. Now, in terms of like your own research, the good thing is that, I mean, depending on what research you're doing, if you're doing qualitative research, like for example, that I do, then I'm free to choose, for example, ask the students how, students ask the participants how they identify racially. And I say that, how do you identify racially? And you could say, for example, if you're doing research, you could say, I'm going to ask you how you identify racially and how you identify ethnically. So let's start with racially. And that way they see that you're trying to make a differentiation between the two. If you just kind of leave it open, then sometimes, you know, that you can get an answer, but that you won't know if the person is saying something because they see it as a race or ethnicity, or are they seeing it as both? And if you tell them like, oh, I'll ask you both, then maybe they'll be like, oh, well, maybe I don't know the difference or whatever. You can get information that's interesting that way too. Helpful?
Yeah, I'm just thinking our funder has requirements that we report both. And so I was just
Yeah.
curious about how to navigate that situation.
Oh, yeah. And I would encourage you to ask both, yeah.
So I know that I said we would have 15 minutes of Q&A, but these talks were so lovely and they went so quickly that I didn't realize that our time is actually a little later than what I initially thought it was. So at this point, we will actually ask our Ed Transformation students to stay for a little more extended kind of workshopping time. And to everybody else who attended, thank you so much. And thanks again to both of our speakers.
So we will have that. Yeah.